October 2015 was a moment in history that was a game changer for South Africa. A student-led movement was born and came to be known as a Fees Must Fall movement. These students were at the forefront of protests at most of the country's institutions of higher learning. The goal was to stop increases in student fees as well as to increase government funding for universities. The biggest win for the Fees Must Fall movement was the announcement of the country's new education policy providing fee-free tertiary education. 5 years later, the fight for equal access to education continues. So to discuss this further, we're joined via Zoom now by Mokwebo, who is a former student activist. She's now the Chief of Staff at the Small Business Development Ministry. Sarah, thanks a lot for joining us this evening. 5 years later, the fight for access to equal education or equal quality education rages on, now further exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, which admittedly has cast the spotlight on the inequalities that continue to persist in the education system. How do we reflect on this movement 5 years on?
Thank you so much, Faith, for having me. I'm glad you actually have mentioned COVID-19, because COVID-19 then became a conversation in institutions of higher learning in terms of access. So when the lockdown began earlier this year, there was a whole lot of conversations about how then is the academic year going to be saved or going to be continued and all those kinds of things. And most times the solutions that were presented were sort of like lower hanging fruits, making mention of the fact that people make use of their laptops and maybe cell phones and all those kinds of things. And outside of the technicalities in terms of accessing online education, the conversation that was not had was how education sort of like differs, or the learning process rather differs in terms of the medium in which you sort of, the medium in which it's delivered rather. So in as much as students would have access to laptops and say data and all kinds of things, but the manner in which the lecturers were teaching was also another complexity, if I should put it that way, that really did make the learning for a whole lot of learners much more difficult for a whole lot of reasons, including the fact that lecturers would maybe, for example, not be readily accessible. But COVID was one such a thing that really did actually highlight or continue to highlight some of the issues that we raised in 2015, to say, in as much as what sort of like sparked the whole thing was the fact that tuition fees were increasing at a much more, at a very ridiculous rate. There's a whole lot of other conversations that we've had about institutions of higher learning that I think were not maybe given the attention that they required. And teaching and learning was one of the many things that we actually did bring up, to say, perhaps we also need to look into how we teach and also how we learn, because that also does, to an extent, further exacerbate inequality. Because, for example, the medium of instruction being English, not a whole lot of learners that are now in varsity actually did learn English as a home language, as it's now known to be in high school. And now when they come into varsity, it becomes maybe a bit more difficult for them to be able to hear what their lecturers are saying. And so I think as we reflect on what happened 5 years ago, I think it's important that we highlight the fact that the conversation there, and in as much as that's what a lot of people focused on, wasn't only about tuition fees, but it was also about institutions of higher learning in themselves. The way in the manner in which they operate, because some of the things that were also discussed at the time when we were talking about saving the year was how assessments were going to be done, and I think that conversation actually should have supposed to have happened then, in terms of finding different ways of doing assessments, because I believe that a whole lot of students might have not performed to the best of their abilities now when they were writing online tests, because that is something that we're not accustomed to. And maybe at the time when we raised this as a fall list, that we also need to look into different way of assessing students. I think some of the challenges that we're presented with now owing to COVID-19 when it comes to the assessment of students was not going to be a challenge, to say, because higher education
So
it really still is
the realities
important.
are clearly drawn out when it comes to higher education, and clearly the inequalities continue to persist, even admittedly so, as the Department of Higher Education has come to the forefront and said, listen, we're in an unequal system. And now when we have to look at the state of TVET colleges, for example, right now requesting students were in protest last week, requesting further funding as well as support and capacity and resourcing at TVET colleges. When you're looking at the way in which online assessments are done, many would say that, yes, we speak about online assessments, but some of the procurement procedures that go into even acquiring laptops, some of those students don't even have those laptops. Data continues to be a major point as well, as not all those students have gone back into universities or even institutions of higher learning in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, which means clearly someone is not coming to the party. Would you say the government has done adequately or enough to address some of those issues? And are they really coming to the party to meet students halfway?
I don't think much was done in terms of meeting students halfway. And also another thing, I feel also like universities sort of said, you know what, government, this is going to be a problem. We're not going to get involved. We'll hear from you what plan you have. And I think to some extent that was quite unfair because institutions of higher learning know their students. And I think they're supposed to know their student needs and where their students come from and all those kinds of things. Because, for example, say Wits gave me a laptop, and I happen to be a student that stays in one room, that is going to affect my learning process because I share that room with probably 3 other siblings as well as my parents or a parent. So those are some of the things that were actually not, say, thought of, which actually do affect how a student performs, because at that time during the hard lockdown, a student would also not have the option to go to a nearby library and maybe say take their online classes from there. So I also feel like universities or institutions of higher learning as a whole sort of relegated responsibility to government, and there were not the people that said, you know what, let's see how we as a sector perhaps could find ways to mitigate this and all those kinds of things. Because one of the many things that were also brought up is that obviously South Africa has majority of poor people, and we also people that stay in what could be called dense settlements, whether informal or otherwise. And I think those kinds of students were supposed to have been given the option to begin with to still continue staying in institutions of higher learning, because whatever regulations that were applying to them at home would be the same regulations that would apply to them when they're staying at res or at what is considered student accommodation outside of the university, because that number one would also make them have access to a number of facilities, including Wi-Fi, and also will give them the space to study. I can't imagine someone being able to study while sharing a room with 3-4 other people and be expected to pass at the end of the day. So I don't think this matter was given the attention that it was supposed to have received. And I'm still also going back to that point that at the time when we raised that we need to sort of like look into different ways of assessing students' knowledge at the end of the year or at the end of a semester, if that process had started at that time in 2015, I think even now we're going to have much more accommodative and inclusive ways of assessing students instead of resorting only to online examination processes, because literally anything could go wrong and that would then place many students at a disadvantage.
Yeah. I mean, Sarah, as we wrap up this conversation, clearly the Fees Must Fall movement is alive today more than ever. Maybe the plight is now starting to evolve to even consider digitization as well as a 4IR, and how is it that this new form of learning, which, by the way, as you said, you raised a long time ago, needs to take shape. So if you had to speak to a student who's beginning first year in 2021, what should that fight look like for them when it comes to continuing the legacy of this movement?
I think firstly, let me say that Fees Must Fall started a long time ago. It's just that it had a new name in 2015. So students have been protesting in institutions of higher learning for accessibility. And some were able to make gains at institution level without the intervention of government. What I would say to a student coming in next year, I think one big thing is to fight for inclusivity. Whether or not it affects you, whether or not you're privileged, you need to fight for inclusivity, because how a system or how an environment or an institution sort of like affects the other person, it does somehow spill over to you. So for me, it really would be accessing inclusivity, and it would be in terms of a whole lot of things, you know. For the most times we've said that our institutions of higher learning are not safe for women. And I've never actually heard that conversation come up the number of times we've actually spoken about GBV in the last few months, that even our universities are not safe. You know, lecturers sexually harass us, fellow students sexually harass us, and all those kinds of things. So for me, it will also for them to look at whatever immediate challenges that they have, but also at the end of the day, it has to be about inclusivity. Everyone is welcome in whatever space they occupy. We all belong to our institutions of higher learning.
Sarah Mokwebo, we'll leave it there. Former student activist and now the Chief of Staff at the Small Business Development Ministry. While on